Hello everyone, my name's Linda Thompson and I'm a team leader at Unison. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. In recognition of Homelessness Week, we're creating this short video to discuss some of the common myths and misperceptions about homelessness. Today we have Professor Guy Johnson joining us. Professor Johnson is the Director of Unison Housing Research Lab at RMIT University and is Australia's first Professor of Homelessness. Professor Johnson worked in homelessness services prior to working in academia. He has authored more than 60 publications on homelessness and housing instability. Welcome, Professor Johnson.
Thanks, Linda.
So let's start with myth number one. Most homeless people sleep on the streets.
Well, that's, as you say, it's the first of many myths around homelessness. A huge number of studies show that the number of people sleeping rough, sleeping on the streets as we understand it, is about 1 in 10. Okay, so they constitute between 10 to 15% of the population. But because they're the most visible, people tend to think that's the homeless population. And there's a danger there because what we know of those who do sleep rough and do sleep rough more or less permanently is that they have very different characteristics to people who have other forms of homeless experiences. So amongst those who sleep rough more or less permanently, we see much higher rates of substance use. We see much higher rates of mental health problems. We see higher rates of physical health problems. So that all creates this image of the homeless as a group of people who are completely without any form of accommodation, who have a range of disabling conditions. And that's actually a myth because most people don't sleep rough permanently. Some might have an experience, a short experience, but most people aren't rough sleepers. They're not the typical population. They're at the sharp end of the spear, as we like to say.
Who or where are the other people who experience homelessness?
Okay, and again, it's a good question because where do people go when they lose their home? A lot of people, particularly families, particularly women, will double up with friends and relatives. Okay, but there's typically only a limited amount of time that you can stay at a friend's or a relative's place. It just gets too cramped and crowded. We also know that a lot of young people will couch surf. They'll stay on a couch and surf between their friends and families and so forth. A lot of people are in what we call temporary boarding house accommodations. So boarding houses, which used to be much more common in the city, but are now distributed out in the suburbs and in fact regional areas, a lot of people will be put in there for a sort of an emergency stay, or they'll stay there for a short period of time, but it's not their permanent place to live. They also don't have access to their own bathroom or the normal facilities that we associate with home. So there's a range of places where people will stay because people will adapt and try and get by. But the key point is that when you think of homelessness, most people think of those who are on the street. It's a much wider, larger, broader population than that.
So myth number two is that most homeless people are drug addicts or alcoholics.
Again, this ties back to the first question, the first myth that you raised. When we look at that visible population, there is a disproportionate representation of those sort of disabling conditions, substance use and mental health problems, no doubt. But when we look at the general population, the overall homeless population, we see that those issues, whilst they are higher, their elevated rates compared to the general community, are nowhere near the extent that people tend to think. So we know that around 40% of homeless people, or people that experience homelessness, will have a substance misuse problem. Similarly, with a mental health problem, it's about 1 in 3 will have a serious mental health issue. Now, they're high rates, no doubt, but the really critical point here is not necessarily that number, okay? The really critical point is what we know from a number of studies that we've conducted in Australia and also overseas is most people tend to think of that as the reason people became homeless, that their mental health problem or their drug issue was the reason they became homeless. What we've found is that if we focus, say, on substance use, about 2/3 of those who report a substance use issue develop it after they became homeless. And it's often as a coping strategy, just to get by, to deal with the rigor, the grind of day-to-day life. So you start to see that it's not necessarily a causal factor. It plays a role, but for a much smaller number of people than we initially, and certainly what the public expects. But certainly people do develop those problems afterwards. That has really important implications for how we design our services and our interventions. If we think 60% of people become homeless because of drug use issues, we'll put a lot of emphasis on drug and alcohol services as a form of prevention. But if it's closer to 10%, we've got to be looking at other issues to try and prevent them coming into homelessness in the first instance and subsequently developing a mental health issue or a drug issue. That second or third myth around mental health, we start to see a very similar pattern. As I said, good studies point to about 1/3 of the homeless population having a serious mental health issue. But again, we have this sequencing issue, the same as we do with substance use, where we see about half of those who report having a mental health problem in the homeless population develop it after. And if you think about it, living without a home, the anxiety of not knowing where you're going to stay, the stigma of being homeless, that's certainly going to trigger a mental health problem for some people and could exacerbate some underlying conditions for others. So the point there is we can't deny, though, that those two issues are overrepresented in the homeless population, but there's much more nuance in terms of understanding how they relate to people becoming homeless and also what happens to them when they are homeless.
You've mentioned myth number 3 already, which is around most homeless people having mental health issues. Yep. Is there anything more around that you wanted to highlight, given that perception, the general public?
Well, we're also starting to see a whole range of issues around just the broader issue of psychological distress. And what happens when people first enter the homeless population, you start to see, understandably, levels of psychological distress really go up. I mean, the anxiety associated with losing a home, then the anxiety of not knowing what's going to happen. So rates of psychological distress go up quite rapidly. Then what we start to see is a pattern of people getting used to it. Now, if they don't get out quickly, they will adapt. People are remarkably resilient and levels of distress start to diminish. When people exit homelessness, though, we see a very interesting pattern. Among women and single and families headed by women, the levels of psychological distress once they get out of the homeless population disappear almost immediately. For single men, though, moving into housing, their rates of psychological distress typically go up. And that's because for many single men who've been homeless for a while, they've sort of got used to living in the homeless population. They move out and it's the stress of managing and maintaining a home is actually quite high. So again, when we think about homelessness, resolving homelessness, certainly it involves getting people into housing, but it's also a challenge in those initial stages. And we really need to make sure that there is assistance for people to settle into their housing because it's not as easy as we think.
We've spoken about substance use and mental health problems. Is there anything else you wanted to highlight around major contributing factors to homelessness?
Certainly, there's a couple of things I'd probably want to say here. First, touching on another myth. It's not by choice that people want to be that people are homeless. I mean, this is something that sort of resonates in the public domain where people say, well, why do they choose to be homeless? Choice isn't a factor here at all. No one chooses to be homeless. And if you think about that logically, why would you want to be homeless? Now, some people leave violent situations and they make a choice to do that without another form of housing. It's very different from choosing to be homeless. But what you start to see when you look at the homeless population more broadly is that the overwhelming majority of people are poor. That's a really important factor. And that most people who end up in the homeless population do so because they've experienced some form of shock. It can be what we can call a financial shock. It can be a health shock, or it could be a relational shock. Your partner could leave you, your partner could be violent. A financial shock is all of a sudden you've got a string of bills that you can't afford. And this is the issue for people who are poor, who don't have a great deal of economic or social capital. They have very little buffer. So these shocks, which can be quite random and unpredictable, hit this population. Some people don't have the resources. Some of those people who are very disadvantaged don't have the resources to deal with it. They compound, they build on each other, and for some, they end up losing their housing and tipping into the homeless population. So this idea of shock, is really important to understand why homelessness affects a population who are poor, but why some people who are not poor don't fall in, if that makes sense. Because it really is random in that sense, some bad luck. All of a sudden, you get 3 bills that you can't afford. You decide to pay those instead of paying your rent, and then you spiral out of control in terms of your housing circumstances. So poverty is the key factor here.
Before we lead into myth number 4, I'll provide you with a quote for your commentary. Former Victorian Police Chief Commissioner Graham Ashton once said, "There's no reason people should be sleeping on the street. There are no reasons people should be homeless. There's more than enough beds and accommodation for people to access." So myth number 4, that there's enough emergency accommodation for those who need it.
Anyone who's been working in the sector, anyone who's done any research, and policymakers will know there is simply not enough emergency accommodation for people who are experiencing some form of housing crisis. And if anything demonstrated that, it's got to be COVID. COVID, whilst we responded, and credit to the Victorian government for their response, it was driven primarily from a health perspective. They wanted to get people off the streets and into a place where they were less likely to experience COVID-related harms. The point was they had to use hotels because there simply was not enough crisis or emergency accommodation. And we're talking over 2,000 people have been put into that form of accommodation. It clearly demonstrates that there's simply insufficient emergency accommodation to assist people. Now, the good thing about all of that, despite Ashton's comments, the good thing about that is that we had very low rates of infectious disease transmission and mortality amongst the homeless. But the bad side of it is formally funded crisis accommodation is much better for people than you trying to adapt hotels where all sorts of problems can emerge. I want to re-emphasise this point. This isn't just a Melbourne thing or a COVID thing. Prior to COVID, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare collects a range of data on demand for services. And in the last reporting year, 2019-20, there were 100,000 requests for assistance that went unmet, just under 100,000. I think it was about 95,000. Of those, 60% were for emergency accommodation. Okay, 60% of the unmet demand is for emergency accommodation. So this isn't just a city thing. This happens in suburban, regional, and rural areas. So the reason why he made that call is entirely unclear to me, but he's wrong, and it is another myth.
In that case, public or social housing is the best way to prevent homelessness. Is this myth number 5, or is it actually true?
Well, it's actually true. And we have really good data on what are the best things that we can do to ensure that people who are on low incomes don't experience housing-related crisis and homelessness. So we've done a number of studies, probably the most important one being what's called the Journeys Home study, which had some really robust and well-collected data, longitudinal data. And what we found in that was, compared to people who are in similar social and economic conditions in private rental, social housing provided a huge protective effect from homelessness. People who were in community housing were less likely to fall in, and people in public housing even less likely to fall in. So having affordable housing is a critical element in terms of preventing people falling into homelessness and all of the associated harms that come along with being homelessness can be prevented. So public housing, is expanding the supply of affordable housing is absolutely critical. It's surprising, given the number of people or the number of times affordable housing has been put forward as the key solution to it, that there's very little empirical data that supports it. Australia is one of the only countries with the data set where we've been able to clearly demonstrate the value of social housing purely in terms of preventing homelessness.
Well, we've covered the 5 myths. In conclusion, do you have any final remarks you would like to add?
Oh, look, just sort of broadly, I mean, COVID has brought to everyone's attention a range of housing and health-related inequalities across the community. And governments, by and large, have responded quite well. But we still find that media, policymakers, and to a certain extent, some agencies seem to be obsessed with the visibly homeless. And this is coming back to the first issue. They're an important cohort to deal with, don't get me wrong. But when this, particularly, the City of Melbourne, for instance, is very interested in dealing with rough sleepers, that makes sense because they've got a significant population. But from a broader policy perspective, we've got to make sure that we're attending to those other groups. We have seen a remarkable rise in the number of women experiencing homelessness. And it's not always domestic violence related. We know that the process of the feminisation of poverty has been going on for many, many years, and we're starting to see the price on that. I think, there's questions also about a continued focus on the chronically homeless tends to shift attention away from the sort of the structural factors which are driving it. And that we know 2 things are really important here. When you look internationally, what distinguishes countries in terms of those with high rates of homelessness versus those with quite low rates of homelessness is the nature of their housing market and the shape of their welfare system. So it's a question of equality or inequality. Countries which have got strong safety nets and which have robust housing markets where there is sufficient supply of affordable housing have very low rates of homelessness. Countries like Australia, which has got a real problem with housing affordability and also a safety net which has been eroded over many years, tend to have higher rates. And America, which has the weakest of all safety nets, has the highest rate of them all. So we've got to get the housing right, but we've also got to make sure our safety net is sufficiently strong so that if people do experience problems, that they're not going to end up in the homeless population where their situation get worse. And again, COVID provides some really illuminating information or experiences around this. When we boosted the rate on JobKeeper and JobSeeker, what we started to see was people who'd been living under the poverty line because they were just relying on the government benefits as they were at that stage, talked about being able to eat properly. So there's health impacts there. They weren't worried about paying the rent. They weren't worried about how they were going to get by. So issues of anxiety, they could start to look forward and plan. So getting these 2 things is right. And this means that we've got to understand homelessness as something that is driven not by individual characteristics, but something that is structured into the way we set up our housing markets and we design our welfare systems. In short, we can do better. We can put more affordable housing out there and we can have a much more sensitive welfare system than we currently have.
That makes complete sense, seeing the big picture view there. So thank you very much, Professor Johnson. It's great to go deeper into the subject of homelessness and look at some of the actual facts. And to you all, thank you for watching. Please feel free to share, comment, or even contact us if you've got further questions or thoughts.
Thank you.
Thank you.